It's draft day and everything is still uncertain. What does Atlanta do with the top pick? Will Brandon Ingram or Paul George get traded tonight? All that and more in a draft day episode of Locked On NBA. Let's go.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the daily podcast covering everything you want to know about the association. On Wednesdays, and it's draft days, we got an extra special episode for you today. I'm Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter, host of the Locked On Pelicans podcast. He's Brad Rowland, at BT Rowland, host of the Locked On Hawks podcast. Brad, I appreciate you filling in. The timing was kind of fortuitous on this, huh?
It certainly was. I can't imagine what your usual co-host would have been doing the last few weeks other than covering the draft, right? John Corrales, he's not been doing anything else, right?
No, nothing else. Not like celebrating, staying up till like 5, 6 a.m. in the morning, covering a championship team, anything like that. But this worked out perfectly with you because we've got a lot to cover with the draft, some big potential trades too. And of course, thank you for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, covering it all, rotating cast of hosts here. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. The playoffs are done. Sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So let's start with this here. Brad, what are the Hawks doing with the number 1 overall pick? You've got Alex Sarr, who just talked about declining a workout with the Hawks. It's been rumored maybe he feels that the Wizards are a better fit with them, where they don't really have a franchise cornerstone player. Is he in the running for the top pick? What do you expect Atlanta to do? Like, what's going on with the whole situation there?
Yeah, it's quite busy, let's just say, with the number 1 overall pick in a way that's not typical. You know, last year is almost the outlier the other direction, where there was just no mystery at all. At any point, everyone knew what was going to happen at the top. This is the polar opposite of that, where as we're recording this, no one knows what's going to happen still. I think we've kind of narrowed things down to a couple of guys with regard to Zach Risache, as well as maybe Donovan Clingan, and the Alex Sarr thing is kind of out there too. There's, in addition to what Sarr said, Landry Fields, the Hawks GM, went on local radio and was pretty candid about the workout being turned down by Sarr's camp. They had it arranged, all those things, like more candor than you would expect, I would say, just the day before the draft. So it is certainly wide open. Of course, that's the money question, is what are the Hawks going to do? Candidly, Jake, I don't know the answer. I have some suspicions. I have leans. I'd be lying to you if I said I knew, because I would be really in a good spot if I actually had the goods on this one. But I do think that they are probably down to Risache and Clingan, and it would be kind of a surprise to me now at this point if they went and just like tried to like hold Sarr for ransom. That's one of the popular ideas around Atlanta right now, is just draft him anyway. Like, okay, they could do that, but it seems kind of unlikely to me at this point.
He did say he would show up for whoever drafts him, and that the big thing for him was just getting drafted and going to a team. I mean, we saw this a couple of years ago, right, where there was a lot of kind of uncertainty around the Paolo Banchero draft. He didn't have a workout with the Orlando Magic, and they still took him number 1 overall, and everyone thought Jabari Smith Jr. was going to be the first overall pick. Is this a type of situation where, you know, it's not exactly a rebuild in Atlanta, so they don't want to risk like an upsetted situation kind of thing?
I think kind of, yes. And I'm still of the mindset, like you referenced, if I'm the Hawks and I have Alex Sarr as the number 1 guy on my board, clearly I am taking him anyway. Nothing he has said, nothing that's been mentioned, him not working out would not scare me off of Alex Sarr. But given the intel that's out there, the Hawks could still take him. I'm not saying there's a 0% chance of that. But I find it interesting and maybe just a little bit revealing that Landry Fields was willing to say that they had a workout scheduled that Sarr's camp canceled. That seems like a lot of candor for a guy that you're about to draft. It doesn't make the guy look great, I would say. Maybe I'm overreading that, but it just kind of...
No, I mean, like if you're trying to kind of sell it on a fan base, right? Like this dude doesn't want to be here, or potentially doesn't want to be here. Yeah. Like, isn't a great first impression, right?
It feels more like a preemptive strike as to why you're not taking the guy than it is we're going to take you anyway kind of thing. And look, maybe I'm overreading that. Maybe it's a one big smoke screen, and that's certainly possible. But I wouldn't cross him off my board personally. I have not heard any intel like you said, and like he said. He's not said or messaged that he won't show up. This is not Eli Manning back in the day with the Chargers, where he's not going to come. And I guess probably the interesting thing about all of this is that Well, Alex Sarr is a really good prospect. He is not Wembanyama. He's not Wembanyama. Like, this is not a situation.
This is not like past years, right? Like, this is a weaker draft, and people have been saying that for a while. So it's like, you don't need to roll the dice on Alex Sarr, it feels like, right?
I tend to agree. And for me, I have Alex Sarr number 1 on my board, but not by a lot. It's one of those things where the tier breaks are not significant necessarily, and that makes it a lot both easier and harder. On one hand, it makes it harder because it's not a clear-cut decision. On the other hand, if you don't want to deal with the whole mess, you can take another guy that you find to be relatively similar to Alex Sarr and kind of just go from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll talk more about the Locked On NBA mock draft that all of our hosts did. You took him number 1 overall. Like, you think he's the best prospect in this draft. And, let me ask you this question when it comes to kind of like, we talked about the fan base, right? And coming up with a reason to not draft him because, again, I don't think that's a good first impression. There's also a situation, and more on this in the next segment here, we're teasing ahead on everything, right? Like, there's a potential Trae Young, Dejounte Murray trade here. If you're trying to sell Trae Young on your vision of the future and things like that, you probably want to bring in someone who wants to be there and isn't going to necessarily rock the boat like that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, look, if there's any doubt at all, I think that you're probably better off just moving on. It's really more of a situation if you were locked in on Alex Sarr in particular, it wouldn't scare me off. But if there's any wiggle room at all, I do think it opens the door. And yeah, as a messaging to your team, the Hawks are big on, and some of it's is spin, but the Hawks are very big on Hawks DNA. Like, they're a lot of these talking points, they're into this, like, they're really, really big into the culture stuff, right? And when you say that, when you message that way, you kind of have to live it out. You know what I mean? It becomes kind of hard to be like, hey, we're big into Hawks DNA, but also we're about to draft a guy that might be not the happiest to be there. That's a tough kind of dichotomy to kind of walk through for still a pretty young, inexperienced front office.
Did they work out the other top prospects?
Yeah, in fact, it's been reported, but even Landry Fields said on the record today on the radio that they worked out everybody else that they wanted to work out. Now, how big that is of a range, but I've heard that they worked out at least 6 or 7 guys that were consensus top 8-9 prospects. So I think they probably got everybody else they wanted to. That's what Landry said on the record, and that's what I've heard as well. So how big that net is, we'll see. But they did not have any other issues getting other guys into Atlanta.
Final thing on the number 1 overall pick, because I don't think it affects that much of the draft, right? They take Sarr 1, the draft kind of then follows as it will. If they don't, he goes number 2 and we move on to the 3rd pick. And I don't think it's like this big thing where it's like we're waiting for the draft domino to fall and who's the number 1 overall pick. Any chance they trade it? Did they have talks around that sort of thing?
I think certainly there is more of a chance than you would ever see typically. The last time the number 1 pick was traded was the Markelle Fultz, Jason Tatum thing. That had nuance too, because the entire world knew that Lonzo was going to go number 2. So there was like this interesting cat and mouse game. There's less certainty this time around, but there's 2 sides to this. The Hawks are willing and open to taking calls at number 1, but at the same time, the whole league knows that you're not going to pay a typical price to move up to number 1 overall. So it's the staring contest. How bad do the Hawks want to move down is probably what decides all of this. I think they will take calls all the way up to the very end. And there's been rumblings about Donovan Clingan, for instance. The Hawks would like to probably take him, but not necessarily at 1 if they can help it. Maybe they would in the end, but I think maybe their dream scenario is something with a trade down. But you have to have a suitor. That's the big thing. And whether it's Washington or San Antonio, Houston, whatever, somebody's got to be willing to give you at least something approaching your price that you're asking.
Look, and the Hawks are an expensive team, so trading down and still getting your guy saves you a couple of $1 million. And, they're a team that they're kind of pushing close to the second apron, I think, or getting nearish to that. That's something that probably factors into this too. So, there's uncertainty now, the day of the draft. This is the Wednesday show. There's going to probably be uncertainty until we get the pick is in from the Atlanta Hawks in the 2024 NBA draft. But there's also uncertainty around Paul George, Brandon Ingram, the Hawks factor into that too. Let's look at that. Let's get into some trade stuff before going back to the draft in the 3rd segment of today's episode of Locked On NBA. Today's episode of Locked On NBA is brought to you by my favorite eBay Motors. And I say they're my favorite because I actually use them all the time. The reason my cars are running and on the road is because of eBay Motors. I have my current daily driver Jeep that I like to add stuff to. It's a Jeep. It's what you do. A new roof rack, you can get it over at eBay Motors. I've got an old classic Corvette that I'm restoring. I just ordered new windows for it. It's kind of hard to find window glass for a 50-year-old car. No problem getting it on eBay. And one of the main reasons why I use eBay Motors is because of the eBay guaranteed fit. There have been times I order a part somewhere else, throw it on the car, and all of a sudden the hood isn't closing. And that's an awful situation to be in. But with the eBay guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. And with over 122 million parts for your vehicle, it's not hard to find what you're looking for. And I keep going there because the prices are great. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all of the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home a big win. Keep your vehicle alive over at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. And thank you for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering everything you want to know about the association. For your second listen, again, it's draft. You want to catch up on everything going on? Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'll probably see Locked On Hawks on there after they make the number 1 overall pick. You might see Locked On Clippers. You might see Locked On Pelicans, because two of the biggest names on the trade market are Paul George and Brandon Ingram. But let's start with Brandon Ingram, because this just came out from Jake Fisher with Yahoo that one of Trae Young's maybe like ideal landing spots in a potential hypothetical trade here is New Orleans. You know, I think these two teams make natural sense as trade partners. Both teams feel the need for a shakeup, but who from Atlanta might get moved? And let's look at it through like the lens of Brandon Ingram. If you're Atlanta here and it's like, let's get a deal done for Ingram, like what's the offer? Are you moving Trae Young in something like that? Or are you going to focus on Dejounte Murray first?
I would focus on Murray for a number of different reasons in that. And I'm not disputing Jake's reporting. Jake is very good. Jake hears things and is doing his job very well. At the same time, there are a number of things in play. Number one, I think that if you're the Hawks and you're looking especially at Brandon Ingram, I don't like the fit of Murray and Ingram together at all. So if just for basketball reasons, they're both very good players. They both kind of need the ball. Neither one of them's a great passer. It's kind of a clunky fit. I would describe that as offensively, a couple of on-ball guys, not the best partnership together. Whereas if you're trying to get Brandon Ingram, I think having Trae Young with Brandon Ingram might unlock Brandon Ingram in a way that we haven't seen for a while. Like, I know you cover the Pelicans very closely. I will defer to you on Pelicans matters, but I know in looking at some of this stuff, Ingram shot the ball really aggressively and well when he was playing with more of a pure point guard. And he hasn't had one in a long time. The Pelicans have not been a pure point guard team for a while.
Yeah, I think when you look at him, right, like there's a reason a deal hasn't gotten done. I think both these teams make sense to like make a trade in some capacity, right? Like Ingram for Murray, I think is likely what it would more end up being. And I think the Pelicans, I think Murray just kind of fits them a little bit more. I like Trae Young better. I think Trae Young and Zion would be really, really fun to watch, to be perfectly honest. That would be my ideal target. It's just complicated, man, on some of this stuff. Like it truly is when you get into some of it. You know, Brandon Ingram, I do think he can be kind of a point forward for you, but the problem is the lack of 3-point shooting, and that's declined. And you talked about it with being without a point guard. Zion's kind of the point guard, and he passes up a lot of like wide open 3-point looks to take contested mid-rangers, which just like doesn't exactly work in today's NBA, right? Like when you watched Brandon Ingram in the playoffs against OKC, like he didn't draw a double team ever, and it made this team super easy to defend. So that's kind of the issue here. And like, I don't think either team wants to just make a trade just to make a trade, but also the financial implications are a part of it too. The Pelicans are one of two teams that has never paid the luxury tax, and I think they'd like to probably avoid it if they can. Murray's the cheaper option. He defends. Defensive culture is really important to New Orleans. It's just like things make so much sense there. Like you could, so say the trade was Brandon Ingram for Murray and Onyeka Okongwu. Like, is that like, are we done here? Is that all we need to do? And we're good. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more salary coming from New Orleans, but like, is it as simple as that?
Yeah, I've posited before. I'm sure you have too. Like, I think that the Murray Ingram swap doesn't make sense. The matching salary might be what they bump heads on, what they value. Okongwu, who's a guy that the Hawks have liked, is on a good contract, although it's 8 figures a year, but it's a very valuable contract. I think that might be a little bit too much for the Hawks in a vacuum to give up, especially when you consider that Ingram's expiring. That's part of this too. So
that's a great point of that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I assume if you're the Hawks and you're paying a real price for him, you're going to want to keep him long term, and that's not going to be cheap. As the Pelicans, that's one of the reasons why the Pelicans would look to move him. He's not going to be cheap long term. So that's one of those kind of cross points where all sides have to kind of come together on something that makes some sense for everybody.
Yeah, you're not just trading for Brandon Ingram. You're trading for Brandon Ingram likely on a max deal. So, so what? 4 years, $208 million, something like that. Like, are you comfortable paying Brandon Ingram $52 million a year? Like, he's a good player. Like, he can score 25 points per game, right? He tries on defense. He actually had his best defensive season I think we've seen from him since like his rookie year in Los Angeles. There's a lot to like about him, but the fit with him and Zion Williamson is truly just clunky. So, I think I ultimately, like, I did a prediction show today on Locked On Pelicans. I'm like, here's the draft pick prediction. Here's the trade prediction. And I said, like, we can figure out the other smaller pieces with it. Maybe the 21st overall pick is included, but the core of the deal to me seems to be Brandon Ingram for Murray and Okongwu. Let me ask you this. Is there any chance that just Atlanta doesn't do anything? Just drafts whoever number 1 overall and you call it a day?
I think that there's a chance of like big stuff without going super deep Hawks. Like, they're not quite the Pelicans tax avoidance, but they're pretty close. The Hawks do not want to pay the tax. And right now they're in the tax. So just to get out of the tax, they kind of have to trade a player that is in their top 8. They have no guys that are like making money that don't play for them. So the chances of just doing nothing are pretty slim, but maybe it's
in terms of like drastic moves, let's say. So like Murray or Young, is there a chance they keep both of them? That's how I should have phrased it.
I think there is a chance that they keep both of them. Maybe a higher chance than I would have thought a couple months ago. I came into the offseason thinking that they were almost certainly going to do something to break them up. It seems like now, for market reasons, just for logistics reasons, they might have to keep both, or I shouldn't use half. They might choose to keep both of them because the asking price is not being met. By the way, that happened back in February. They were close on Dejounte Murray deals. They pulled him back because they didn't like the offers. That might happen again if they're willing to keep them again and try it again. The risk there, of course, is that it doesn't work again, and then your markets are even smaller.
Yeah, look, the Pelicans were in talks with them, right? I don't think they were looking to send Brandon Ingram or anything. Maybe that kind of changes it. But again, that contract or the future contract for Ingram, I think, is a real sticking point. Another guy, though, that could get dealt tonight, let's keep it in the Western Conference here, is Paul George. So I actually didn't prep you for this. I'm going to hit you with something here.
It's all right.
On Wednesdays, we play real or fake. So I'm going to pose a real or fake for you, but we also have a theme song. So we got to play that first.
Yeah.
Real or fake? Just ask John and Jake.
Okay, no John, but you're subbing in here, Brad.
Also.
So, real or fake? Paul George will be on the Clippers next year.
I am still going to say real, but with a lot less conviction than I would have had a while ago. Does that make sense? Is that
it does.
Fair thing to say?
Yeah, you can throw like the asterisks on there.
There's just so much noise, right? Like, I think at one point, at least the public messaging was the overriding factor. Paul George likes to be in Los Angeles or Southern California. And if all things are equal, I think he'd prefer to be there, but maybe all things are not equal. There is the opt-in and trade option. There's all kinds of machinations that could happen here. And I think some of them still lead to him sticking around, but the argument might be that if it was going to happen, it would have already happened.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think it's real that he'll be on the Clippers next year. Now, he might get traded from the Clippers next year, but I think what we're probably seeing, because they definitely seem to be at ahead with the contract negotiations and the extension negotiations, where and he hasn't done himself any favors, man. Like, him going on the podcast that he does and everything, and like almost coming up with like every sort of excuse, I don't think is a particularly good look for him. It seems like it's a Brandon Ingram situation again, right? Like, they don't want to pay him a full max in what he thinks he's worth. He wants that. So how do you bridge that gap? And you're running into some trouble here. And one of the things that's not working in Paul George's favor is like, that dude has lost so much leverage over the past year that it's, to me, kind of almost comical. When Kawhi Leonard signed that like out of nowhere below market extension that was only 3 years instead of 4, and they seem like they want to sync all of those guys up on the same years of their contract, that makes tons of sense. Like, he lost leverage there. The Indiana Pacers making moves this season, kind of taking him out of the cap space running hurts them. Does a team like Philly want to pay for him, right? Or is Orlando's not going to do it? It seems that's put him in a little bit of a bind where maybe like his only choice is like, I'm just going to pick up my near $50 million player option.
You need suitors. You just have to have suitors on the outside, and the leverage point's a great one. The Kawhi thing is a great one. Just the fact that they didn't win again, and granted, there's injury reasons, but there's always injury reasons for the Clippers. Like, it's not like that's a huge surprise.
Yeah, that's them like every year, man.
And Paul George is 34 years old. Like, he's still really good, but I do understand on the outside not wanting to line up to pay Paul George a 4-year max right now. I get it. He'll be 38 by the end. That's probably going to be a bad contract by the end. So if you're a team that's like worried about long-term, like if you're the Thunder or one of these like hypothetical destinations for him going back to Oklahoma City, yeah, it'd be great for next year. But what about the year after that and the year after that?
Yeah, you run into some that terrifies you at the end of that contract, I think, right? And part of it is still going to be I think like a lot of sticker shock on guys and some of the money that they're going to be making. I think at a certain point, like no one's ready for $60 million a year, $70 million a year contracts, right? Like we're gonna be like, that dude's getting that much when it's all kind of relative. But I think he's just, as you said, like run out of suitors when it comes to this. So like the only option is, he's not going to get the extension he wants. So let's just opt into the player option. Maybe he plays well and they figure out a deal in the beginning, at some point during the season. Or maybe it's just like, this isn't working and then you can trade him at the trade deadline or something along those lines. Or we just do this whole dance again at the end of next season where it's a similar thing depending on what he wants to do with the option. But at that point, he is for sure a free agent. But also like, you just don't see free agency like it used to be, right? Like very few teams have cap space. It's not like big names just sign into cap space anymore. It's usually extended trades, sign-in trades, and that limits some options when it comes to things. I did on my show talk about a crazy like Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum for Paul George, and I forget what the other pieces were. I think I had Russell Westbrook in there, maybe Zubac coming back to New Orleans, and then it was like, if it doesn't work out, you just trade Paul George again, trade Zion, and kind of blow it all up, which was kind of fun to like think about. But it'll be interesting. The draft is, it's a deadline-driven league. That's why things don't get done until a day or two before the trade deadline. The draft is a deadline. Let's see if either of these two guys get moved later tonight. And we'll have the reaction on Locked On Hawks, Locked On Pelicans, Locked On Clippers, and Locked On NBA here. So coming up next, let's shift back to draft talk a little bit more. We did a Locked On NBA mock draft. Kind of weird, right, Brad? What'd you think?
Very, very weird, as usual, with our group.
Yeah, which I like because we know what we're talking about too, though. We're connected. Let's break that down and talk about some of the things that surprised us and see if there's maybe some surprises in store on draft night here. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On NBA. Today's episode of Locked On NBA is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. I love them so much I never want them to stop. But as the NBA playoffs are now over, we get fewer games, and the sports just aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want, and all I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. Look, Major League Baseball is still going on. There's still things to get in on with the action there. So this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, rotating cast of hosts. It's kind of fun being able to do this on draft day now that it's a 2-day event, not normally getting to do the draft day show here, talking about what Atlanta's going to do at the top, talking about big trades. We'll get into more with the draft here too. For your second listen, go check out your local Locked On show. Your favorite team has a show. They're going to break down the draft picks. A lot of us are going to have insight you can't get anywhere else. So make sure you subscribe to your favorite team show, whether it's the NBA. Look, we got it for the NFL, Major League Baseball as well. We are all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's start with this. Do you think there's any surprises coming in this draft? Do you think someone's going to fall? Do you think someone's going to get taken really high? Does our Locked On NBA mock draft shed any insight into this at all?
I don't know how much the mocks sheds, just because it becomes silly in a fun way. I always enjoy doing it. I don't know how predictive those things are, but I do think in a draft that has no consensus, it lends yourself to chaos. It feels like to me, like it'd be more of a surprise if it was like, pick your mainstream big board and it went down like that. I'd be very surprised if it was like that. You got these guys, but I won't name them all, but these guys that have huge ranges: Ron Holland, Isaiah Collier, these very polarizing prospects. It only takes one. That's the famous saying. It's actually true. It takes one team.
I think teams are going to have very different draft boards this year, right? Like it doesn't feel like there is, like last year there was a bit of a consensus, right? You're like, cool, you got Wemby, and then your second tier is these guys. Then there's the third tier. Here it seems like after the top 6, let's say, like everyone's kind of in the same bucket for the most part, right? Like It's just like, like pick your flavor of what you like here. There's a number of like intriguing bigs that could go, to use our mock draft for an example, it goes Sarr, Klingon, Shepard, Reza Shea, Buzelis, Castle, Williams, Connect. Let's stop there at 8, right? Like that checks out a little bit, I think, but like it starts to get kind of weird after that, I thought. And I was kind of surprised, like the Pelicans need a big man at 21. Jonas Valanciunas isn't going to be there anymore. So like you have a chance to go and get a guy like Khalil Ware or Deron Holmes or Zach Edey or Kyle Filipowski. And literally all of those guys were off the board before 21, which when you look at mock drafts, kind of the somewhat consensus one, like that isn't the case. And that like genuinely surprised me, I thought.
Yeah, for sure. And look, that it's possible. Like you said, it gets very, even in the top 6, it gets pretty open. Like I do a lot of draft work, even when the Hawks don't have the number 1 overall pick, I do a lot of draft stuff. And the whole league, there's no consensus. There might be a guy or two that's everybody's top 3 or 4, but man, there are some wildly divergent boards, publicly, privately, and that lends itself to your point. Like if you're trying to get a specific position or a specific player in the middle of the first round, you might have to go up, man. Like there's not you can't expect to stay put and get your guy all the time in this class.
Yeah, right. Like, and it seems like this is a crazy draft to try and trade up, and given all the talk about how it's weak, but it's like, as you said, all it takes is one team falling in love with a guy and being like, we've got to get him. And then they're going to make a move to do something like that. In our Locked On NBA mock draft, we had guys like Rob Dillingham fall to 21 to the Pelicans. You also had like Jared McCain from Duke, right? Fall to 25 to the Knicks in this one. Those were 2 names falling in there that kind of surprised me because, at least Dillingham seems like he's a top 10 guy in this draft.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. Those were surprising falls. I will say on Dillingham, he is very polarizing because of just the limitations that he has size. Physically. He's so small. And it takes a team that kind of is point guard needy to take him. So there are certain spots on the board that if he passes those spots, you can kind of see the fall potentially coming until you find a team that's like a best available player. Like I think in this case with you, I speak to you're the team that picked them, but like, it's just like,
it was just too much. It was too, the value was there. I had to do it. Good. And also they need a point guard, I think. So like that helps.
Right. No, I mean, that definitely made sense. I mean, it was an easy pick for you in my mind. Watching the draft, I was like, hey.
All right, I'm glad that you're agreeing with me here. That's cool.
I liked it quite a bit. But yeah, it's sometimes especially with these outlier guys positionally, if a team doesn't need you, like centers are to speak to your center point, centers are the opposite in some ways, but also similar. If a team needs a center, they need a center. And if they don't, they don't. So it's very polarizing as far as like guys could fall or they could rise based on team need and what teams are trying to look for, because Zach Edey is a one position player. You know what I mean? There's no mystery about what Zach Edey is going to be as far as like skill set and all of that stuff. How good he's going to be, obviously a mystery, but if you want a center, there are centers available, but if you don't, there are, it's more flexible than that.
What do you think about Edey?
I think Zach Edey, and this is going to sound patronizing, I promise it's not, is one of the best college basketball players of my lifetime. He's fantastic. I think he's a first round pick in this draft. I think that people that I think are smart that have him like in the top 5 are pretty crazy. I don't.
Yeah, really I agree with that.
I do think that somewhere in the even beginning like late lottery, mid first round, down to the 20s, you can sell me there. I think that the defensive questions in space are real, to be sure. But you also can't teach that size. And by the way, he's extremely skilled. I think it's undervalued how skilled he is, just because he's so big. I get it, but he actually does use his size, and he's very skilled.
I like him, man. I don't think he's like a top end starting center in the league. He might be a real good backup, which look, if you take that guy at 17, 15, something like that, I think that's a good draft pick. He's going to draw attention from defenses, even if he can't shoot, just because he's massive, and he moves, I think, a little bit better than most people think. He's not the most lumbering guy, but he's not like, a Deron Holmes II, right? Who reminds me of like Naz Reid, who shoots threes, defends the rim. You look at some of those centers, him, Ware, and others who do have some court spacing there, some rim protection. Like everyone kind of needs a guy like that, I think. So even if you draft them knowing they're going to be kind of a backup for you or change of pace big, I think there's some teams that are going to fall in love with some of those guys. You mentioned Isaiah Collier earlier. What do you think about him?
I think he is pretty much the quintessential boom bust guy in this class, where if he hits his ceiling, it might be one of the highest in the entire class. It would not surprise me that much if he was the best player in this draft in 5 years. It would also not surprise me that much if he was either out of the league or a clear backup. You know what I mean? Maybe out of the league's too strong, but it's very, very wide range because if the shot doesn't go in, it's going to be a challenge. But he has that creation upside that a lot of guys don't have in this class. And if you're looking for just upside, he is very enticing through that lens.
Is there anyone that you think's like a bit of a sleeper in the first round, or someone you would just completely stay away from?
Stay away from is harder just because I don't think that anybody's like disqualifying that I regularly see in the first round. And because not to go back to this
fair. Yeah.
It is such an eye of the beholder draft that it's almost like I have trouble coming up with the strong negative take because I can just kind of see what you want to see on a lot of guys. I have preferences, of course. As far as sleepers are concerned, you mentioned one already. I'm definitely a Deron Holmes guy. And I also don't quite understand. And in our draft, he actually went 10th. The Ron Holland falling to the teens and 20s thing in some of these mock drafts blows my mind. I don't understand that at all. And look, he's not safe, I wouldn't say, but he like Collier is another guy that I could see. There's actually star upside there with Ron Holland. I'm not saying he's gonna get there, but in a draft that doesn't have a ton of that, taking him somewhere in the lottery for me is like kind of a no-brainer.
No, I agree with that. I love Tristan da Silva. I think that's a guy that doesn't scream like insanely high ceiling, but I think his floor is incredibly high. And if you get him like right out of the lottery, that's a guy to me that is just going to like step in and contribute. And I get going for upside in the draft, particularly when you're like a rebuilding team. But to some playoff team that just needs a dude that's going to be your 8th, 9th guy that comes in and like doesn't hurt you at all, like he screams that sort of player to me. And I kind of love that. The guy that I'm like hoping the Pelicans don't take is Yves Missi here. Reminds me a little too much of Jackson Hayes and got burnt on that one before.
I kind of like Yves Missi, but not in New Orleans. So I'll back you up on that. I don't like the fit necessarily of what he probably. The best case scenario for Yves Missi is not what the Pelicans need. I don't think personally. Again, you're the expert on the Pelicans, but I think the fit stuff there. If I was trying to find a center, he probably would not be the one that I'd want if I was the Pelicans.
Just really raw. Like I think he can be like a vertical spacing above the rim lob threat that gives you rim protection, but like in 3 years,
in a while. Yeah.
Right. Like in 3 years. And that doesn't do New Orleans any good. In 3 years, if it didn't work out with him, you might be trading Zion and like starting over. So like,
True.
what's the point of there? Any final thoughts on the draft here? What about a guy like Kyle Filipowski? I'm kind of torn on him a little bit.
I like him, but you have to have a plan. I think that he's not going to be your every down starting center because he doesn't have that defensive upside. I think he's actually a little bit underrated as a defender. Not that he's great, but like there's this book on him that he's terrible, and you can decide why that is, Duke, etc. But I think that he actually is not a bad defender. He's instinctual, and offensively, the dribble, pass, shoot guys, he's got a real skill level that you don't just find for a guy who's 6'11", 7 feet tall. Short arms, I get all that. He's not the physically gifted guy in the world, but like I think he's a top 20 guy in this class. And it's certainly, if you understand what he can be, if you have a plan for him, like the guy next to him is almost as important as what he's going to be, because he can't anchor for you, but he also has like kind of centerish size.
Yeah, like I get the negative wingspan being a knock on him, but it's also not like he has like T-Rex arms or anything, right? Like it's like a 2 or 3 inch like deficit there, which is like not ideal. Don't get me wrong, but to me that doesn't scream like end of the world for someone with his size. And I think you'll see teams knocking him down. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how this goes. Like I really don't exactly know how this draft's going to go. We still don't know exactly what Atlanta's doing number 1 overall. I know you're going to have it covered over at the Locked On Hawks podcast. We'll have it covered here tomorrow. Nick Angstad, Pat the Designer, on the Locked On NBA podcast. I believe they're going to have one of the Locked On NBA draft guys on there too, kind of breaking down the first round, some of the big things too. So it's going to be a show no one wants to miss. Brad, I appreciate you filling in, talking some draft and hoops with me here.
I'll have to poke fun at Corrals when I see him next about how he no-showed on the day of the draft. Shameful from John. I'm kidding. Thanks for having me.
needed a break, I think, here. Which is good. He's just still basking in that championship glow, so we're happy for him.
He's been busy.
He's Brad Rowland. I'm Jake Madison. This has been the Locked On NBA podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.